the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. Violence in Israel and Palestine, what this famous pianist has to tell you, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. What year are we in? That's the question many are asking about Israel and Palestine amid everyday violence and news of attacks and killings sometimes multiple times in a single hour, while at the same time there is seemingly no peace process in place for the first time in more than 2 decades. Typically, for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, each side is claiming alleged points of origin for the violence and blaming the other. Most of those claims surround the Temple Mount and the mix of Israeli provocation in visiting there and Palestinian provocation in harassing visitors, and the respective governing bodies for both antagonizing in various ways. As with every moment of heated conflict and the conflict overall, each side believes the other started the aggression. In last year's Gaza war, Israelis claim the conflict began with a kidnapping and murder of 3 Jewish boys. Palestinians claim that various deaths caused by Israelis were the true catalyst, and so on to the beginning of the conflict. What marks this wave of attacks as different is their nature and the fact that we are seemingly back to the drawing board on Israeli-Palestinian relations. The nature of these attacks are different because they involve stabbings and attacks using cars as battering rams and so forth. They aren't the kind of attacks to this point that suggest significant amounts of organization, premeditation, and funding. The place of these attacks in the larger Israeli-Palestinian chronology suggests a few things about where the larger conflict goes from here. The Oslo peace process has been more or less declared over by both sides. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed that there will not be a Palestinian state under his reign on the eve of his re-election earlier this year. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said that Palestinians are no longer bound by any agreements with Israel in a speech before the United Nations in September. The wave of attacks suggests to some that Abbas has lost the ability to control violence against Israelis, a key responsibility for governing the West Bank. And yet the fact that attacks have not yet scaled up, and the fact that some of them at least are being conducted by Israeli Arabs within the Green Line who aren't under his jurisdiction, reveals a measure of control. For Abbas, an independent Palestine is increasingly on a path to reality. The Palestinian flag was just raised at the United Nations, which voted last year to recognize Palestine as an independent country. Several European and other countries have already recognized Palestine or expressed plans to do so. Typically, terrorist violence from Palestinians comes from groups who don't want a two-state solution, but want to fight longer and harder to control all of Israel. That is certainly the message of clerics coming out of Gaza during this latest wave of attacks. For Palestinians, then, there is the long game, the one in which Abbas can over a decade or more increasingly gain legitimacy no matter what Israel and the United States say or do in objection. And then there's the very long game, the century-long or longer struggle that Palestinian hardliners want to pursue to eventually control all of the area recognized today as Israel, the West Bank, Palestine, and Gaza. And what is the game that Israel is playing? Perhaps no game at all. For years, we've been reporting on the 3 Israeli elections since 2009 and the various attitudes expressed by the Israeli voting public. The consistent thread in all of them has been that Israel isn't, and Israelis aren't, taking a position on how to achieve a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is and has been a vacuum on this topic from Israeli leadership on both sides of the electorate consistently for more than 6 years now. To the degree that any solution has been proposed by the Israeli government, it has been from far-right ministers like Naftali Bennett, saying that the path forward is for Israel to annex the West Bank. In this latest wave of attacks, Israel faces a very elusive foe. There are no organizations claiming responsibility. There are no groups to raid. Many times, it seems individual Palestinians have simply made the decision to step forward and terrorize the Israeli population with any means available. There is no leadership for Israel to attack and no flow of arms for Israel to stop. With armed violence, Palestinian hardliners progress in their goal of ending a two-state solution and bringing about their own rule. The question for Israel and for Abbas is whether any alternative will be pursued. Moving on to the world of the arts, Meredith Gansman profiles a pianist who's making waves.
How do you get to Carnegie Hall? The old adage is practice, practice, practice. Jewish pianist Simon Gracie, who made his debut this week at the famed New York City Concert Hall, had to practice and take a plane from Paris, France.
It has been a lifetime dream it's since I decided to be a professional musician, the dream became even bigger because, of course, it's one of the most important venues in the world. It's a venue where all the superstars have played, where all the most famous classical musicians have played, but also the non-classical, the jazz musicians. It's like a sanctuary full of souvenirs and of memories, of intense musical moments.
The Paris-based pianist is of Mexican and Lebanese descent, which has influenced his music.
Look, it's a pride to have all these heritages in me just by birth. It's very unusual cultures mixing all together, and me being raised in Paris, which is a wonderful city, it's a little bit like New York. It's a city, a cosmopolitan city where all cultures come, and there's not many people who live there, who are from there. It's all like a melting pot of different cultures. So I think that's very important as an artist, because art is open-mindedness, and this kind of multiple background gives one lots of angles to see the world from.
Grayshi's Jewish heritage has also informed his musicianship. Late Jewish and Russian pianist Vladimir Horowitz is one of Grayshi's favorite composers.
Being a Jewish musician, being Jewish in general, it's a pride also for me, because it's such a big culture. And if you look at the music history, so many composers and great artists, musicians and performers were Jewish, had a Jewish background. So the two worlds, let's say the classical music world and the Jewish roots, are very, very tightly linked.
Grayshi has been preparing for over a year for his Carnegie Hall premiere, but in another sense, he has been readying himself for this moment since the age of 4, when he began playing piano.
Nobody played at home, but it was just sitting there, and I had like a kind of a magnet with the instrument. I would go and try to play some sound, to produce some melodies from tone, from ear, or just dabble on it. It was like my little toy.
His Carnegie Hall debut concert brings together music from all sides of his heritage, Grayshi says.
It's a kind of a marriage between the very mainstream European repertoire, and especially the great composer Franz Liszt, the Hungarian composer, together with some new discoveries, some composers who might be less known in America or in Europe, but who has like a total musical genius, and they are mainly from Latin America, like a region to which I'm very related.
The concert featured an eclectic mix of music by Godowski, Goshawk, Laquana, Ponce, and Villa-Lobos, much of which he developed a taste for growing up in Europe and often visiting Mexico and discovering the indigenous composers.
Because once you've discovered these pieces, you don't play the same way as before, because they add something to your musical identity, which is based on the Latin rhythms, on the Latin American melodies. It's kind of a halfway between the pop and the classical.
Last month, Grayshi also released his second album, Duels. For more information on Grayshi, visit his website. For the Jewish Channel, I'm Meredith Gansman.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, on this week's episode of Up Close, what can men be doing better? How can we support women and increase their representation in key areas? Being a dad is hard. It's even harder when laws and policies are designed to keep dads from doing their fair share. Josh Levs talks about that in All In, how our work-first culture fails dads, families, and businesses, and how we can fix it together. And then, when we think of breaking the law, most of us discover that world through fiction. Within crime fiction, increasingly some of the best work is done by women, and so is some of the best of the work from previous eras. That's the argument of Sarah Weinman, editor of Women Crime Writers, 8 suspense novels of the 1940s and 50s. Here's some of the highlights from my interview with Sarah Weinman. So how did you get so involved in such seedy matters as are described in some of these books?
I'm not so sure I'd describe them as seedy, certainly dark and certainly suspenseful. Now, in terms of women crime writers, we knew a lot about their male counterparts, but it felt like they had the critical reputation and their female counterparts weren't as well known, at least in contemporary culture.
When you talk about these women crime writers of the 40s and 50s, one of the things that you wrote about in your introduction was the idea that they invented a genre of kind of like domestic suspense.
Yes.
Right. And what is the difference between domestic suspense and what had been going on to that point?
Well, I view domestic suspense first and foremost as a temporal thing. So I usually define it as stories of suspense that involve character-driven psychological studies that were published at the onset of World War II and the dawn of women's liberation. So that gets us between the early 40s and the early 70s. And because society was changing so much at the time, here were stories that were essentially against this backdrop of around the Second World War, when men were off to war and women were supporting themselves and their families. And then when the men came back, there was this incredible displacement and awkwardness in trying to essentially retrofit back to the way things were supposed to have been, or what people thought it should have been. And some of that change, some women may not have minded, and others found it a lot more difficult. So that tension is certainly present in the late 1940s novels, and in particular the early to mid 50s novels. So stories of fractured marriages, damaged relationships between parents and children, and single people, especially women of varying ages, but especially those who feel like they might be on the shelf, and how they're adapting to all the changes around them.
At the same time, though, I wonder if you talk about the fact that these are women writers writing for a largely female audience.
Yes.
And then also, not just a largely female audience in terms of the books that would result, but in the serialization and in the placement in women's magazines. Was there an idea there that, to a sense, that this was like a safe space, because you really could publish a lot of things in a women's magazine and not expect to hear from men?
That's still true today. I mean, if we look at magazines like what Marie Claire's doing, or how Cosmopolitan has sort of rebranded itself under its current editor, Joanna Coles, and I think Glamour is starting to do a lot of this now, where it's a predominantly female readership, but they still feel like, well, women want to read about tough topics. They want to read about crime. They want to read about health. They want to read about politics. They want to read hard news. And just because it's not in a national news magazine container doesn't mean that it isn't valid. And so, by extension, many of the stories that are being told here, aside from being in a domestic space, they're also about larger societal concerns. And so it's essentially a little bit of a Trojan horse. You think you're getting one thing, but actually running underneath, you might be getting another.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast, available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well.